There's something about losing the person who raised you that changes a man forever. For Jonas McCord, that moment came when word reached him in the high country that his grandfather, the only father he'd ever known, had passed on. After 10 years living alone in the Rockies, Jonas rides down to the old cabin outside Red Bluff Crossing, expecting to find nothing but memories and dust. But the door is bolted from the inside, and when he steps through, he finds a lamp still burning on the workbench, though no one's been there for months. Beneath 2 heavy canvas covers sit handcrafted wooden crates, each carved with his family's brand. Inside are maps, gold claims, and a letter written in his grandfather's careful hand, speaking of betrayal, buried fortune, and a name Jonas hasn't heard since the war. A name that could destroy everything his family ever built. What secret was the old man protecting all those years, and who would kill to keep it buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kerosene lamp cast long shadows across the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Shadows that danced and flickered, like ghosts of memories Jonas McCord thought he'd buried a decade ago. He stood in the doorway, one hand still resting on the frame, the other clutching the letter that had brought him down from the high country. His grandfather's handwriting, strong and deliberate, even in those final days, seemed to pulse with urgency in the amber light. Jonas was 42 years old, though the mountains had carved him into something that looked both younger and older at the same time. His face was weathered brown as saddle leather, lined deep around the eyes from squinting into high-altitude sun and wind. His beard, more grey than the sandy brown it had been in his youth, hung to his chest in the fashion of men who have no one to impress and no reason to change. He stood just over 6 feet, lean and hard as mountain pine, with hands that could skin an elk or gentle a frightened colt with equal ease. The cabin hadn't changed much. It stood as it always had, nestled in a stand of ponderosa pine, where the foothills began their long climb toward the Rockies. One room mostly, with a sleeping loft above, and a stone fireplace that his grandfather had built stone by stone when Jonas was just a boy. The smell of the place hit him harder than he'd expected. Pine smoke and gun oil, leather and tobacco, and underneath it all, the particular scent of the old man himself, as if he might step out from the shadows at any moment. Jonas had been 12 when he came to live here. His parents had died of fever that terrible winter of 1855, and his grandfather, Samuel McCord, called Sam by those who knew him well, had ridden 3 days through snow to fetch him from the orphanage in Denver. Jonas could still remember that ride back, sitting in front of the old man on his big roan horse, wrapped in a buffalo robe, watching the mountains grow larger with each mile. A man needs to know the land, his grandfather had told him that first night in the cabin, sitting by the fire. Not just know it to use it, but know it the way you know your own heartbeat. The land was here before us, boy, and it'll be here long after. We're just passing through, and the question is, what kind of mark we leave. Those words had shaped everything that followed. Samuel McCord had taught Jonas to read the weather in the color of the sky at dawn, to find water by watching where the deer walked at dusk, to move through timber without sound, to shoot straight and true, but never wasteful. He'd taught him to track a cougar across bare rock and to know which plants would heal and which would kill. But more than that, he'd taught him about honor, about keeping your word even when it cost you, about standing for what was right, even when standing alone. The lessons had come during long days checking trap lines in winter, during spring hunts for elk in the high meadows, during summer evenings fishing the cold streams that tumbled down from the peaks. His grandfather never wasted words, but when he spoke, Jonas listened. There was a rightness to the old man, a solid core that seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. Jonas had stayed until he was 20, and then the war had come. He joined up with the Colorado Volunteers, fought in campaigns he still didn't like to think about, seen things that haunted his sleep even now. When he came back 3 years later, he'd been changed in ways he couldn't explain to anyone, least of all himself. His grandfather had taken one look at him and understood without words. "The high country's still there," the old man had said, "waiting if you need it." And Jonas had needed it. He'd spent the next 2 years helping around the cabin, trying to settle back into the rhythm of the life he'd known before. But the nightmares came regular as clockwork, and he'd wake in the dark with his heart hammering, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, hearing screams that existed only in memory. He'd grown restless, unable to stay still, unable to shake the feeling that something was coming for him just over his shoulder. Finally, one morning in early spring, he'd packed his gear and told his grandfather he needed to go higher, to find some peace in the places where men rarely went. The old man had nodded, pressed a leather pouch of gold into his hand, enough for supplies when he needed them, and said only, "You'll know when it's time to come back." That had been 10 years ago. Jonas had gone deep into the Rockies, built himself a small cabin above the tree line, where the air was thin and clean, and the only sounds were wind and water, and the occasional cry of an eagle. He'd trapped beaver and marten, hunted elk and bighorn sheep, and slowly, season by season, he'd found something like peace. He'd come down twice a year to the little settlement of Timber Ridge for supplies, but otherwise he'd seen no one, spoken to no one, wanted no one. He'd thought about his grandfather often during those years, wondered how the old man was faring, told himself he'd ride down for a visit come next spring. But spring would turn to summer and summer to fall, and the peace of the high country would hold him, and another year would pass. He'd convinced himself there was time, that his grandfather was made of iron and oak and would live forever. Now, standing in the cabin with that lamp still burning, how was it still burning? Jonas felt the weight of all those unvisited years pressing down on his chest like a stone. The letter in his hand was brief. It had reached him by way of a trapper who'd stopped at his cabin 2 weeks ago. A man named Carson, who sometimes carried mail and messages between the scattered mountain folk. "Your grandfather passed," the letter read, written by someone named Sarah Brennan, who identified herself as the land office clerk in Red Bluff Crossing. He was found in his bed peaceful on the morning of September 12th. The Reverend held a service. "We laid him to rest in the cemetery on the hill above town. He spoke of you often and with great pride. I'm sorry for your loss." The date on the letter was September 15th. It was now October 7th. His grandfather had been in the ground for nearly a month, and Jonas had only just learned of it. The guilt of that settled into his bones alongside the grief. But it was the second letter, the one he'd found in the crate, written in his grandfather's own hand, that had turned grief into something harder and colder. Jonas set down the land office clerk's note and unfolded his grandfather's letter once more, though he'd already read it a dozen times. "Jonas," it began, "if you're reading this, then I've gone on ahead, and I pray you'll forgive me for the burden I'm about to place on your shoulders. There are things I should have told you years ago, but I thought I could handle them myself. I was wrong. There's a man named Thomas Garrett. We were partners once, back in '56, when we filed a claim together up in the hills north of here. We found gold, Jonas, a vein richer than anything I'd seen before or since. But Garrett wanted it all for himself. He tried to buy me out for pennies, and when I wouldn't sell, he waited. He's patient, I'll give him that. Over the years, he's built himself into something powerful in this valley. He owns half the county now, and he's got the law in his pocket. 3 months ago, I discovered he'd forged documents transferring my half of the claim to his name. When I confronted him, he smiled and told me there was nothing I could do about it. He was probably right. An old man's word against his lawyers and papers. But Jonas, that claim is your inheritance. It's your birthright. And more than that, it's about what's true and what's a lie. I've left you everything you'll need to prove the fraud. The original maps, the filing documents, everything. It's in the crates. I don't ask you to do this, boy. I know you found your peace in the high places, and you've earned that. But if you choose to fight this, know that I believed in you then, and I believe in you now. Whatever you decide, know that you made my life richer just by being in it. Your loving grandfather, Samuel McCord, Jonas folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket next to his heart. Then he turned his attention back to the crates. They were solid pine, expertly joined, with the McCord brand, a simple mountain peak with an M beneath it, burned deep into the wood. He'd already opened them, already seen what lay inside, but now he began to sort through the contents more carefully. The maps were hand-drawn but precise, showing the claim boundaries in relation to landmarks Jonas recognized: a lightning-struck pine, a particular rock formation, the fork of two streams. The filing documents bore the stamp of the Territorial Land Office and were dated August 1856. Both names appeared on them: Samuel McCord and Thomas Garrett, equal partners. There were assigners' reports, letters of agreement, even a photograph, faded now but still clear, showing two young men standing side by side in front of a mine entrance, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Jonas studied the photograph for a long moment. His grandfather couldn't have been more than 30 in the picture, his face unlined, his hair still dark. The other man, Garrett presumably, looked about the same age, stocky and solid, with a broad smile that showed white teeth. They looked like friends, like men who trusted each other. Jonas wondered what had happened to turn that friendship into betrayal. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, Jonas found one more thing: his grandfather's pocket watch. It was a solid piece, made of brass and steel, with a cover that opened to reveal a white face and black Roman numerals. On the back, engraved in careful script, were the words, "Truth outlasts iron." Jonas remembered that watch. His grandfather had worn it every day, had checked it with ritual precision at noon and at sunset. When Jonas was 12, the old man had let him hold it, had shown him how to wind it gently so as not to damage the delicate mechanism inside. "This watch belonged to my father," Samuel had said, "and his father before him. It's kept time through 3 generations now, and it'll keep time through 3 more if it's cared for. But more important than the time it keeps is what's written on the back. Truth outlasts iron, Jonas, remember that. Iron rusts and breaks. Mountains wear down to dust. But truth stands." Jonas opened the watch now and saw that it had stopped at 3:17. Whether that was morning or afternoon, he couldn't say. He wound it carefully, listening to the familiar click and whir of the mechanism, then held it to his ear. The steady tick-tick-tick was like a heartbeat, regular and strong. He closed the cover and slipped it into his vest pocket, letting the weight of it settle there, a familiar comfort. Outside, the sun had set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and deep purple. Jonas stepped out onto the porch and breathed in the evening air, crisp with the promise of coming winter. Somewhere in the timber, a great horned owl called, and another answered from farther up the slope. The stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant and perfect. He'd come down from the high country, expecting to bury his grief alongside his grandfather, and then return to his solitude. But now, standing here with the old man's letter against his heart and the pocket watch ticking in his vest, Jonas knew that wasn't going to happen. His grandfather had asked nothing of him, had given him the choice, but some choices aren't really choices at all. Some debts can only be paid one way. Jonas McCord had spent 10 years in the mountains, learning to be at peace with himself. Now he was going to have to remember how to be at war with other men. He'd do this for his grandfather's memory, for the truth that outlasted iron, and maybe, though he didn't let himself think too much about this part, he'd do it because he'd been alone long enough. Tomorrow, he'd ride into Red Bluff Crossing. Tomorrow, he'd start asking questions. Tomorrow, he'd find out just what kind of man Thomas Garrett had become. But tonight, Jonas sat on the porch of his grandfather's cabin, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, and let himself remember all the good years that had come before the betrayal. He owed the old man that much at least. When last night of peace before the storm, Red Bluff Crossing had changed more than Jonas expected. What he remembered as a scattered collection of buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and maybe a dozen houses, had grown into something that aspired to be called a town. New structures lined both sides of the main street, their fresh lumber still golden against the older, weathered buildings. A sign proclaimed the establishment of a proper bank, and another advertised the coming of the railroad within the year. Jonas rode in on his grandfather's horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Charlie that he'd found in the small corral behind the cabin. The animal had been well cared for, fed and watered by neighbors, he supposed, though no one had been around when Jonas arrived. Charlie knew the way to town without guidance, his hooves raising small puffs of dust from the dry October road. It was mid-morning when they arrived, and the street bustled with activity. Wagons rolled past loaded with lumber and supplies. Women in town dresses moved between the shops with baskets over their arms. Men stood in clusters, talking business and weather. Jonas felt their eyes on him as he passed, taking in his mountain garb, buckskin pants, wool shirt, and a coat made from elk hide. His beard and long hair marked him as an outsider, someone from the wild places, and people in towns always noticed outsiders. He tied Charlie at the rail in front of a building that bore a sign reading Land Office County Records. The structure was new, built of milled lumber with glass windows and a proper door. Jonas paused before entering, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd spoken to another person, beyond the briefest of exchanges with passing trappers. He'd grown accustomed to silence, to his own company, and the prospect of conversation felt almost foreign. The door opened with a small bell's chime. Inside, the office was organized and clean, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a large desk positioned near the window. Behind the desk sat a woman, perhaps in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple grey dress with a white collar, and her hands were ink-stained from clerical work. She looked up as Jonas entered, and her expression shifted from professional courtesy to something more curious. "You must be Jonas McCord," she said, rising from her chair. Her voice was clear and direct, the voice of someone accustomed to managing details and dealing with difficult people. "I'm Sarah Brennan. I wrote you about your grandfather." Jonas removed his hat and nodded. "Ma'am, I got your letter. I'm grateful for it and for you seeing to the burial." "Your grandfather was a good man," Sarah said, and there was genuine warmth in her words. "He came into the office every few months, always courteous, always with a kind word. The whole town felt the loss." She gestured to a chair opposite her desk. "Please sit. I imagine you've come about his affairs?" Jonas sat holding his hat in his lap. "Partly that, but also I need to look at some records. Property records specifically." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or caution. "What property are you interested in?" "There was a gold claim filed back in 1856, Jonas said carefully. "Filed jointly by my grandfather and a man named Thomas Garrett. I need to see the current records for that claim." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Jonas saw her hands tighten slightly on the edge of her desk. "I see. May I ask why?" Jonas considered how much to reveal. Something about this woman suggested honesty, but he'd been away from people too long to trust his judgment. "I have reason to believe there may be discrepancies in how that claim was transferred." Sarah stood and moved to one of the filing cabinets. She opened a drawer and began sorting through documents with practiced efficiency. After a moment, she pulled out a thick folder and brought it back to the desk. "This is the file for the North Valley claim, filed August 1856, original claimants Samuel McCord and Thomas Garrett." She opened the folder and spread the documents across the desk. Jonas leaned forward, studying them with growing tension. There were the original filing papers, matching what he'd found in the crate. But there were also newer documents, a bill of sale dated 1862, signed with his grandfather's name, transferring full ownership to Thomas Garrett for the sum of $500. "That's not his signature," Jonas said flatly. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then very quietly she said, "I wondered about that." Jonas met her eyes. "You've seen my grandfather's signature before?" "Many times. He had very distinctive handwriting, firm, upright, consistent. This signature is similar, but there are differences. The capital M in McCord, for instance. Your grandfather always made it with 3 distinct peaks, like mountains. This one has only 2. Did you say anything?" "To anyone?" Sarah's jaw tightened. To whom would I say it? Thomas Garrett owns half this valley. He's on the county board. The sheriff worked as his foreman for 15 years before taking the badge. Even if I reported suspicions of fraud, who exactly would investigate? Jonas sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of what she was telling him. How did Garrett build all this? If you don't mind my asking, Sarah returned to her chair and folded her hands on the desk. After the war, he came back with capital. No one quite knows where he got it. Some say he made shrewd investments, others say less savory things. He bought up land when others were struggling, made loans when the bank wouldn't, and slowly built an empire. Now he owns the cattle operation north of town, the lumber mill, a stake in the new bank, and enough property that he controls most of the water rights in the valley. And the mine still operates, though not as openly as you might think. He runs maybe a dozen men up there and they don't talk much. But the gold comes down regular enough. I've seen the assayer's certificates. Jonas pulled out the papers from his grandfather's crate, including the original survey map. He laid them on the desk next to the county records. This is what my grandfather left me. Sarah studied the documents with a careful eye, comparing them to what was in the official file. Her finger traced the boundary lines on the old survey map, and her expression grew more troubled. Mr. McCord, Jonas, this map shows different boundaries than what's currently on record. According to this original survey, the claim extended much farther east, including the entire ridge where the richest vein was found. Could the boundaries have been resurveyed? Not according to these records. There's no notation of any survey after the original. She looked up at him. This is evidence of significant fraud. If this original map is authenticated, it would prove Garrett not only forged your grandfather's signature but also altered the property boundaries to exclude the most valuable section from what he claimed to have purchased. Jonas felt a cold anger settling in his chest. Is there anyone in this town I can take this to? Anyone who'll look at it fairly? Sarah's expression was sympathetic but firm. The circuit judge comes through once a month. The next session is in 3 weeks. But Jonas, you should know that Judge Hendricks has been accepting Garrett's hospitality for years. I'm not saying he's bought, but he's certainly influenced. What about the territorial marshal? You could try. The marshal's office is in Silver Creek, 2 days' ride north. But Garrett has friends there too, and without more evidence than conflicting documents, I'm not sure how far you'd get. Jonas gathered the papers and folded them carefully. Then I'll need more evidence. That could be dangerous, Sarah said quietly. Your grandfather wasn't the first person to challenge Garrett's claim to property. There was a homesteader 5 years ago who said Garrett had moved boundary markers on his land. The man fell from his horse one night and broke his neck on the rocks below the trail. Accident. The sheriff said so. Sarah paused, seeming to wrestle with something. Then she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook. I keep records of things that trouble me. Unofficial records. There have been 7 deaths in this county over the past 10 years that were ruled accidental or natural, but that seemed suspicious to me. 6 of those 7 had been in disputes with Thomas Garrett over property, contracts, or money. Jonas took the offered notebook and flipped through it. Sarah had documented each death with dates, circumstances, and notes about the relationship to Garrett. It was careful, methodical work. Why are you showing me this? Jonas asked. Sarah's eyes met his, and he saw both sadness and determination there. Because my husband was one of those 7. He worked in Garrett's mine, and he'd started asking questions about where the gold was really coming from, whether Garrett was claiming ore from sections that weren't part of his legal claim. 3 months later, there was a collapse in one of the tunnels. They brought out 4 bodies. Henry was one of them. I'm sorry, Jonas said, and meant it. The mine inspector ruled it an accident caused by faulty timbers, Sarah continued. But Henry had been a miner for 20 years. He knew how to shore up a tunnel. And the other 3 men who died? They were all part of Henry's crew, the ones who'd been helping him track which sections were producing which ore. She took a breath, steadying herself. I can't prove murder. But I know my husband, and I know he wouldn't have made the kind of mistakes the inspector claimed. Jonas closed the notebook and handed it back to her. This is dangerous information to keep. I know. But someone needs to remember. Someone needs to keep track. Sarah slipped the notebook back into her drawer. Your grandfather knew about my suspicions. We talked several times before he died. He was trying to gather his own evidence about the claim fraud. I think he believed that if he could prove Garrett stole from him, it might open the door to investigating other crimes. Did he tell you what evidence he had? No, he said it was safer for me not to know details. But he did say that he'd hidden something important, something that would prove everything if it came to light. Jonas considered mentioning the second letter his grandfather had written, but something held him back. If there was more evidence hidden somewhere, evidence his grandfather had died protecting, then Jonas needed to find it before revealing its existence to anyone, even someone as seemingly trustworthy as Sarah Brennan. I'd like to see the mine, Jonas said. Is there a way to get up there without going through Garrett? Sarah thought for a moment. The main road goes right past Garrett's ranch house. He'd know about any visitors. But there's an old trail that comes in from the east, through the timber. Your grandfather showed it to Henry once. It's rough going, but it would get you close without being seen. Can you draw me a map? Sarah pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching. As she worked, the door to the land office opened and 3 men entered. They were ranch hands by the look of them, wearing spurs and carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of men who worked for someone powerful. The one in front was tall and lean, with a scar running down his left cheek. Help you, gentlemen? Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. The scarred man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just wanted to let you know that Mr. Garrett will be coming by tomorrow to review some property transfers. He'd appreciate it if you had the files ready. Which properties? He'll tell you tomorrow. The man's gaze shifted to Jonas, taking in his appearance with obvious assessment. Don't believe we've met. You new in town? Jonas stood slowly, putting himself between the men and Sarah's desk. Just passing through. Funny, your horse has the McCord brand. That'd be old Sam McCord's brand, wouldn't it? It would. The scarred man's expression shifted, becoming more interested. So you'd be the grandson, the one who ran off to the mountains. We heard you might show up, what with the old man dying and all. My condolences for your loss. Appreciate that, Jonas said evenly. Mr. Garrett wanted me to tell you, if I ran into you, that he'd be happy to meet with you. Talk about your grandfather's property, settle up any outstanding business. He's a fair man, Mr. Garrett is. Always willing to help out. I'll keep that in mind. The 3 men stood there a moment longer, making their presence felt, establishing dominance of the space. Then the scarred man touched his hat brim. Ma'am, enjoy your day. They filed out, and Jonas watched through the window as they mounted their horses and rode off toward the north end of town. He noticed they didn't go far, just down to the saloon, where they tied up and went inside, watching, waiting. Those were Garrett's men, Sarah said quietly. The one with the scar is called Slade. He's Garrett's foreman now, and he's the most dangerous of the lot. The other 2 are brothers, Pete and Charlie Denton. They do whatever Slade tells them. Jonas turned back to her. They'll be watching me now. Yes, which means you need to be careful. Very careful. She finished the map and handed it to him. This shows the trail to the mine. But Jonas, maybe you should consider just taking what money your grandfather left and going back to the mountains. This fight might cost you more than it's worth. Jonas folded the map and put it in his pocket alongside his grandfather's letter. My grandfather taught me that some things matter more than safety. Truth is one of them. Sarah studied him for a long moment. You look like him, you know. Same eyes. Same stubborn set to your jaw. She smiled faintly. He'd be proud of you for coming down. But he'd also want you to be smart about this. I'll do my best. Jonas put on his hat. Thank you for your help, Mrs. Brennan, and for what you did for my grandfather. Sarah, she said. Call me Sarah, and Jonas? If you need anything, come find me. I close the office at 5, but I live above the general store, the room at the back. Blue door. Jonas nodded and left the office, very aware of the eyes watching from the saloon down the street. He mounted Charlie and rode slowly toward the edge of town, giving no indication that he knew he was being observed. But as he passed the cemetery on the hill, He turned Charlie up the slope and found his grandfather's grave without difficulty. The marker was simple wood, but well made, with Samuel McCord's name and dates carved deep. Someone, Sarah probably, had planted wildflowers around the base. Jonas dismounted and stood before the grave, hat in hand, feeling the weight of everything unsaid during those 10 years of silence. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long, but I'm here now, and I'm going to make this right. I promise you that." The wind moved through the pines above the cemetery, sounding almost like a voice, almost like approval. Jonas stood there a while longer, then mounted and rode back toward the cabin. He had planning to do, and he had a feeling time was running short. Behind him, one of the Denton brothers separated from the group at the saloon and rode north toward Garrett's ranch at a gallop, carrying word that Samuel McCord's grandson was asking questions about the mine. The storm Jonas had sensed coming was about to break, and there would be no more nights of peace. That evening, Jonas spread the maps and documents across his grandfather's workbench, studying them by lamplight as the cabin settled into darkness around him. The pocket watch lay open beside the papers, its steady tick-tick-tick marking time like a heartbeat. He picked it up occasionally, feeling the weight of it, reading the inscription on the back, "Truth outlasts iron." His grandfather had given him this watch when he was 12, on a spring morning when they'd been checking trap lines up in the high country. They'd stopped to rest beside a stream, and the old man had pulled the watch from his vest and placed it in Jonas's hands. "This belonged to your great-grandfather," Samuel had said. "He carried it through the war with Mexico. Your grandfather carried it through the California gold rush. I've carried it through everything that's come my way. And one day, when the time is right, it'll be yours to carry." Jonas had been almost afraid to hold it, this precious thing that connected him to men he'd never known. "What if I drop it? What if I break it?" "Then we'll fix it," his grandfather had replied. "But you won't break it. You've got steady hands, boy, and a steady heart. That's what matters." Now, turning the watch over in his palm, Jonas understood something he hadn't grasped as a child. The watch wasn't valuable because of the gold in its making or the precision of its mechanism. It was valuable because it represented something that had been passed down, protected, honored. It was a symbol of continuity, of family, of the idea that some things were worth preserving across generations. And that, Jonas realized, was exactly what his grandfather had been trying to protect with the gold claim. Not the wealth itself, but the principle behind it, that a man's honest work and fair dealing meant something. That truth mattered more than power, that you didn't let thieves prosper just because fighting them was difficult. Jonas closed the watch and slipped it back into his vest pocket. Then he turned his attention to the documents again, looking for patterns, for weaknesses in Garrett's fraud, for anything that might serve as leverage. The forged signature on the bill of sale was obvious once you knew to look for it. But Sarah was right. Without additional evidence, it would be his word against Garrett's lawyers and carefully constructed paper trail. He needed to see the mine itself to understand what Garrett was protecting. And he needed to find whatever additional evidence his grandfather had mentioned in the letter. The old man had written that he'd left Jonas everything needed to prove the fraud, but Jonas had found only the maps and filing papers. Where was the rest? He thought back to his grandfather's habits, his careful ways. Samuel McCord had been a methodical man, someone who believed in having a plan and sticking to it. If he'd hidden evidence, he would have chosen a place that was safe, secure, and meaningful. Somewhere Jonas would eventually think to look, but Garrett's men wouldn't. The mine itself? Possible but risky. If Garrett controlled access, any evidence hidden there could be discovered and destroyed. The cabin? Jonas had searched it thoroughly and found nothing beyond what was in the crates. The grave? Jonas dismissed that immediately. His grandfather wouldn't have hidden something important in a place that required desecrating his own burial site. Then it came to him, the place where he and his grandfather had spent the most time together, where the old man had taught him the most important lessons. where they'd gone every spring and fall for as long as Jonas could remember. The high meadow, 3 hours' ride into the mountains, where they'd hunted elk and camped under the stars. There was an old line shack there, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but his grandfather had kept supplies stored there in a metal box buried beneath the floor. That had to be it. Jonas felt certain of it in his bones. His grandfather would have hidden the evidence somewhere only Jonas would think to look, and that meadow was as much a part of their shared history as the cabin itself. But first, Jonas needed to understand what he was up against. He needed to see Thomas Garrett face to face, to take the measure of the man, to understand what he'd become in the years since that photograph was taken. And he needed to do it in a way that made clear he wasn't going to be intimidated or bought off. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Jonas saddled Charlie and rode north toward Garrett's ranch, following the main road this time, making no effort at stealth. If Garrett's men were watching, and Jonas was certain they were, then let them see him coming straight on. Let them report back that Samuel McCord's grandson was the type to face things directly. The ranch was impressive, Jonas had to admit. It sprawled across a valley floor, with the efficiency of serious money behind it. A large house built of milled lumber and stone, barns and corrals laid out in organized rows, cattle grazing on hillsides that stretched as far as the eye could see. This was the empire Sarah had described, built on the foundation of stolen gold and probably worse. Jonas rode up to the main house and dismounted, tying Charlie to the rail. Before he could knock, the door opened, and Slade stepped out, the scarred foreman from the land office. 2 other men flanked him, hands resting casually near their sidearms. "Mr. Garrett's expecting you," Slade said. "I'll need you to leave your weapons on your horse." Jonas unbuckled his gun belt slowly and draped it over his saddle horn. He kept his knife. A blade was a tool as much as a weapon in the mountains, and he wasn't going to give it up. If they objected, they'd have to take it. Slade noticed but said nothing. He led Jonas into the house, through a well-appointed front room, and down a hallway to a study. The room was lined with books and maps, dominated by a large desk made of dark wood. Behind the desk sat a man Jonas recognized from the photograph. Though age and prosperity had changed him considerably, Thomas Garrett was in his late 60s now, his hair gone white, his stocky frame running to fat. But his eyes were still sharp, and they studied Jonas with the intensity of a man accustomed to evaluating people for weakness. He wore an expensive suit and a gold watch chain, and his hands, resting on the desk, were soft, unmarked by labor. "Jonas McCord," Garrett said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I'm pleased to finally meet you. Your grandfather spoke of you often. Please sit." Jonas remained standing. "I won't be staying long." Garrett smiled, a practiced expression that suggested patience with lesser men. "Straight to business, then. I appreciate directness. You've been to the land office, I understand, asking questions about an old claim. I want you to know I bear no ill will about that. Your grandfather and I had our disagreements, but that was business, nothing personal. You forged his signature on a bill of sale and stole half his claim," Jonas said flatly. "That seems personal to me." Garrett's smile didn't waver. "I purchased his share legally and fairly. If the signature looks different from other samples, well, men's hands change as they age. Your grandfather was getting on in years. Perhaps his penmanship suffered. He was 50 when that sale was supposedly made. Nevertheless, the transaction was legal and recorded properly. The claim has been in my sole possession for over 20 years. Any challenge to that ownership would be difficult to sustain in court, especially given that your grandfather never contested it during his lifetime." Jonas leaned forward slightly, letting his presence fill the space. "Why didn't he contest it?" "You'd have to ask him that. Perhaps he felt $500 was fair compensation. Perhaps he wanted to avoid conflict. Perhaps he simply decided the claim wasn't worth the trouble." Garrett spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "The point is, Mr. McCord, that what's done is done. However, I'm a fair man. I recognize that you're your grandfather's heir, and I'm willing to offer you a settlement. Let's say $2,000 for any claim you might have. That's 4 times what your grandfather received. And it's more than generous given the legal realities. I'm not interested in your money. Garrett's expression hardened slightly, the mask of geniality slipping just a fraction. Then what are you interested in? The truth, and justice for what you did. Justice. Garrett said the word like it tasted bad. Let me tell you about justice, Mr. McCord. I came back from the war with nothing. Your grandfather had this cabin, had land, had prospects. I had scars and nightmares and empty pockets. I built what I have through hard work and smart decisions. The mine made me wealthy, yes, but I earned that wealth by developing it properly, by running it efficiently, by taking risks your grandfather wouldn't take. You mean by stealing it? Garrett stood, his bulk imposing even in his age. I mean by being willing to do what was necessary. Your grandfather was a good man, Jonas. I don't deny that. But he was also naive. He thought the world operated on handshakes and honor. I understood that the world operates on power and leverage. That's not theft. That's reality. And the people who challenged you, Jonas said, the ones who died in convenient accidents, was that reality too? Something cold moved behind Garrett's eyes. Careful, son. You're talking about things you don't understand. I understand that my grandfather is dead and that you're responsible for it. Maybe not directly, but you killed him as surely as if you'd pulled a trigger. You stole his legacy and you broke his heart. Garrett was silent for a long moment. Then he moved to a cabinet and poured himself a whiskey. He didn't offer one to Jonas. Your grandfather was dying anyway. Heart trouble. Dr. Halian confirmed it. He had maybe 6 months left at best. What I did or didn't do made no difference in the end. It made a difference to him. It makes a difference to me. Then you're a fool. Garrett drained his glass and set it down hard. I've made you a fair offer. More than fair. I suggest you take it and go back to your mountains. Because if you insist on pursuing this, you'll find that reality in this valley is shaped by power, and I have all of it. You have nothing but old papers and righteous anger. That won't serve you well. Jonas turned toward the door. We'll see about that. Mr. McCord. Garrett's voice stopped him. Men die in these mountains all the time. Falls from horses, accidents with guns, getting lost in the timber and freezing to death. It's a dangerous place for people who don't know their way around. Jonas looked back at him. I know my way around just fine. Do your men? He left before Garrett could respond, collecting his gun belt from Charlie and mounting up. Slade and the other men watched him ride off, their expressions unreadable, but Jonas could feel the threat in their gaze as he rode back toward the cabin. Jonas's mind was already working through next steps. Garrett had confirmed everything Jonas suspected. The man was a thief, a manipulator, and almost certainly a murderer. He had power and money and no conscience about using them. But he'd also revealed something important. He was worried. Worried enough to offer money. Worried enough to make threats. Which meant he saw Jonas as a genuine threat, despite his show of confidence. That was useful information. It meant Garrett wasn't as secure as he pretended. It meant there were weaknesses to exploit. Jonas would find them. And when he did, Thomas Garrett would learn that truth really did outlast iron, and that some men couldn't be bought, frightened or killed into submission. 2 days after his confrontation with Garrett, Jonas returned to Red Bluff Crossing. He needed supplies for the ride up to the high meadow, and he wanted to check in with Sarah to see if there had been any developments. The encounter at Garrett's ranch had changed the equation. Jonas was now openly opposed to the most powerful man in the valley, and that meant every move he made would be watched, evaluated, possibly countered. He found Sarah at the land office just as she was preparing to close for the day. She looked up as he entered, and he saw relief flash across her face. I heard about your visit to Garrett's ranch, she said, closing the ledger she'd been working on. The whole town's talking about it. They say you turned down his offer. Word travels fast. Slade made sure of it. He's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're a fool who doesn't understand how things work around here. Sarah moved to the window and drew the curtains, a gesture that suggested the need for privacy. He's also been asking questions about you, where you've been, what you did during the war, whether you have friends or allies in the territory. What did people tell him? Not much, because most folks don't know much. You've been gone a long time, and your grandfather kept to himself in his later years." She turned back to him. "But Jonas, you need to understand what you're up against. Garrett doesn't make empty threats. If he warned you about accidents, he meant it." "I know." Jonas leaned against the desk, his expression thoughtful. "That's why I need your help with something. I need to know about Dr. Halian." Sarah's face darkened. "James Halian. He's been the town doctor for about 15 years. Came here from back east after some kind of trouble with his medical license. Garrett helped him get established, and they've been close ever since. Garrett mentioned that Halian diagnosed my grandfather with heart trouble. Said he had 6 months to live. That's what Halian claimed, yes. He told people at the funeral that Samuel had been suffering for months but refused treatment." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "But Jonas, your grandfather came to see me 3 weeks before he died. He seemed healthy, strong, clear-minded. He never mentioned being ill. In fact, he told me he was planning to ride up to check on some property markers come spring. So Halian lied. I can't prove it. But I've noticed something over the years. When someone dies who was inconvenient to Garrett, Halian always has a medical explanation ready. Heart failure, stroke, natural causes. He signs the death certificates, and that's the end of it." Jonas absorbed this information, feeling the pieces fall into place. "My grandfather thought he was being poisoned. He wrote about it in a letter. Do you know if Halian visited him in the weeks before he died?" Sarah moved to her desk and pulled out her unofficial notebook, the one where she tracked suspicious deaths. She flipped through pages, then nodded. "According to the church ladies who bring meals to shut-ins, Halian visited your grandfather 4 times in the month before his death. Said he was checking on his heart condition. Each time he brought medicine that was killing him. That would be my guess. But proving it would be nearly impossible. Halian was careful, and even if you could prove poisoning, connecting it to Garrett would be another matter entirely." Jonas straightened, his jaw set. "One thing at a time. First, I need to find the rest of my grandfather's evidence. He mentioned in his letter that he'd hidden proof of everything. I think I know where. Where? Better if you don't know the details. But I'll be gone for a few days, up in the high country. If something happens to me, if I don't come back, there's a tin box buried under the floorboards in my grandfather's cabin. It has copies of all the documents. Get them to the territorial marshal in Silver Creek, even if you have to ride there yourself." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "You're really going through with this? Even knowing what it might cost?" "I am." She reached into her desk and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Then you should see this. I've been to the Historical Society, looking through old newspapers. I found some things you should know about." She spread several yellowed newspaper clippings on the desk. The first was from 1857, reporting the discovery of gold in the North Valley claim. The second, from 1859, described a dispute between business partners over mining rights. The third, from 1862, was an obituary for a man named Robert Finch, described as a mining assayer who had died in a riding accident. Robert Finch was the original assayer who evaluated your grandfather's claim, Sarah explained. He's the one who certified how rich the vein was. He died 3 months after the fraudulent bill of sale was recorded. Let me guess, Dr. Halian signed the death certificate. Actually, no. This was before Halian came to Red Bluff Crossing. But the circumstances were suspicious. Finch was an experienced rider, and his horse was found grazing peacefully beside his body. No sign that the animal had been spooked or thrown him. Jonas examined the clippings, particularly focusing on an old photograph accompanying one of the articles. It showed 3 men standing in front of a mine entrance. He recognized his grandfather and Garrett from the photo he'd already seen, but there was a third man in this image, someone older, with wild white hair and an intense expression. "Who's this?" Jonas pointed to the third man. Sarah looked closely. "I think that's Dutch Henry. He's an old prospector who still lives up near the mine. He worked the claim with your grandfather back in the early days. Folks say he's half crazy now, drinks too much and talks to himself, but he might remember things about the original partnership. Where can I find him?" "He's got a shack about 2 miles east of town, back in the pines." But Jonas, if you're going to talk to him, be careful. Dutch is unpredictable, and people say Garrett's men have tried to run him off before. He might not trust you. I'll take my chances. Jonas gathered the clippings carefully. May I keep these? Take them. I've made copies. Sarah reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. Jonas, I need to tell you something. My husband died trying to fight Garrett in his own way, and it cost him everything. I've been gathering evidence for 5 years, and I haven't made a dent in Garrett's power. Sometimes I wonder if justice is even possible here. It is, Jonas said firmly. My grandfather believed it, and I believe it. The truth outlasts iron, Sarah. Everything Garrett's built is iron, strong for now, but it'll rust eventually. The truth won't. Sarah squeezed his hand, and for a moment they stayed like that, two people bound together by loss and the desire to see things made right. Then she withdrew and stood up, back to business. I'll keep gathering information while you're gone. And Jonas? Be careful up in that high country. It's beautiful, but it's dangerous, and you'll be alone up there. Alone is something I'm good at, Jonas said. But even as he spoke the words, he realized they felt less true than they had a week ago. He'd been alone for 10 years, and he'd thought that was what he wanted. But standing here in Sarah's office, seeing the determination in her eyes, feeling the connection of shared purpose, he understood that his grandfather hadn't just left him a claim to fight for. He'd given him a reason to rejoin the world of people, to remember that some fights couldn't be won alone. Jonas left the land office as evening settled over Red Bluff Crossing. He had 3 stops to make before heading up to the high meadow, the general store for supplies, Dutch Henry's shack for whatever information the old prospector might share, and then back to the cabin to prepare for the journey. He didn't notice the man watching from the alley across the street, or the way that man slipped away as soon as Jonas mounted his horse. He didn't see the rider who left town at a gallop, heading toward Garrett's ranch with news that Jonas McCord was asking about Dutch Henry and planning to leave town. But even if he had noticed, Jonas wouldn't have changed his plans. The die was cast now. The only way forward was straight ahead, into whatever dangers waited in the mountains, toward whatever truth his grandfather had died protecting. Dutch Henry's shack sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, looking like it might collapse if a strong wind came through. The structure leaned noticeably to one side, and the roof was patched with bits of canvas and tar paper. A thin stream of smoke rose from a crooked stovepipe, and several rusted mining implements lay scattered in the weeds around the building. Jonas approached slowly, calling out before he got too close. "Hello, the house." "Dutch Henry?" A long pause, then a voice cracked with age and whiskey. "Who's asking?" "Jonas McCord. Samuel McCord's grandson." Another pause, longer this time. Then the door opened, and an old man stepped out, squinting into the fading light. He was thin as a rail, with wild white hair and a beard that hung to his belt. But his eyes, though bloodshot, were sharp and assessing. "Sam's boy," Dutch said, and something like a smile crossed his weathered face. "Last time I saw you, you weren't more than knee-high to a grasshopper. Come on in, then. Mind your head on the doorframe." Inside, the shack was surprisingly organized despite its exterior decay. Furs hung from the walls. Mining tools were arranged neatly in one corner, and a small stove provided warmth against the evening chill. Dutch gestured to a rough-hewn chair and poured coffee from a dented pot. "I was sorry to hear about Sam," Dutch said, settling onto a stool. "He was a good man. Best partner I ever had, back when we were working the claim." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Jonas said. "The claim." And Thomas Garrett, Dutch's expression darkened. He took a long swallow of coffee, and Jonas caught the smell of whiskey in it. "That name. Haven't heard it spoken in this shack for years. Won't have it spoken now, neither. I need to know what happened. Between my grandfather and Garrett. What happened is what always happens when good men trust bad ones." Dutch stared into his cup. "We found that claim in 56, Sam and me and Garrett. We were partners, the 3 of us, equal shares. We hit a vein so rich it made your eyes water just looking at it. Pure gold running through the quartz like veins in a man's arm. What went wrong? Garrett got greedy. That's what went wrong." Dutch stood and moved to a battered chest in the corner. He pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I kept records. Every ounce we pulled out, every division of the take. Garrett wanted more than his share, said he'd put up more capital at the start. That was a lie, but he had paperwork to back it up. Forged paperwork, but who was going to challenge it? Jonas leaned forward. Do you still have those records? The real ones? Right here. Dutch tapped the journal. Every entry in my own hand, dated and witnessed. Shows the equal split, shows how Garrett started taking more, shows how he pushed me out first, then went after Sam. Why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you testify? Dutch's laugh was bitter. Testify to who? Garrett owned the sheriff even back then. I tried once to make noise about it, and 2 weeks later my claim, a different one, smaller thing over in Copper Creek, got jumped by claim thieves. When I went to report it, the land office said I'd never properly filed. All my papers had disappeared. Garrett, of course Garrett. After that, I kept my head down and my mouth shut. Figured staying alive was better than being right. Dutch took another drink, his hand shaking slightly. But Sam wouldn't let it go. He kept pushing, kept trying to prove the fraud. I told him to walk away, told him Garrett would kill him if he had to. Sam said some things were worth dying for. Jonas felt his throat tighten. That sounded exactly like something his grandfather would say. Did Garrett kill him? Did he have him poisoned? Dutch was quiet for a long moment. I can't prove it, but Sam came to see me about 2 months before he died. Showed me a letter from an assayer in Silver Creek, confirming the original survey of the claim. Sam said he was going to take it to the territorial marshal, make a formal complaint. I told him not to, told him it was too dangerous. He just smiled and said he'd lived a good life, and if it ended while doing something right, that was as fine a death as any. The letter. Do you know what happened to it? Sam said he was hiding it somewhere safe, somewhere only someone who really knew him would think to look. Dutch fixed Jonas with a penetrating stare. He said his grandson would know where when the time came. Jonas nodded slowly, his suspicion about the high meadow confirmed. One more thing. Do you know Dr. Halian? What can you tell me about him? Dutch spat on the floor. That man's no doctor. He's a poisoner in a fancy coat. I've seen him operate. He's Garrett's cleaner, the one who makes problems disappear. There's been at least 6 people who died convenient deaths after crossing Garrett, and Halian signed every death certificate. Can you prove any of it? Not in a way that would hold up. But I know what I know. Halian came to town about 15 years ago, right after some scandal back east. Garrett set him up, paid for his office, made sure he got the county medical position. After that, Halian was his creature, doing whatever needed doing. Jonas stood and pulled out a small leather purse from his coat. Dutch, I need that journal. I'll pay you for it. Keep your money. Dutch thrust the journal into Jonas's hands. This is for Sam. He was the best man I ever knew, and Garrett killed him as sure as if he'd pulled a trigger. You take that journal and you use it. Prove what Sam couldn't prove. Make that bastard pay. Jonas took the journal carefully. Inside, page after page detailed the mine's operations in Dutch's careful hand. Production numbers, split ratios, dates and signatures. It was exactly the kind of contemporaneous documentation that could corroborate the other evidence. There's one more thing, Dutch said, moving to a wooden crate in the corner. He pulled out a metal strongbox and opened it with a key from around his neck. Inside was a stack of official-looking papers. These are copies of the original assayer's reports, the real ones, before Garrett had them altered in the county records. I stole them 20 years ago, figured they might be worth something someday. Jonas examined the papers. They showed the full extent of the gold deposits, including sections that Garrett now claimed were outside the original claim boundaries. With these reports, combined with the original survey map, Jonas could prove that Garrett had not only forged the transfer of ownership, but also redrew the claim boundaries to grab even more than he'd stolen originally. Dutch, this is exactly what I needed. Why didn't you come forward with this before? The old man's face was sad. Because I'm a coward, son. Pure and simple. I valued my life more than I valued the truth. But I'm old now, and I've been drinking away the guilt for 2 decades. Maybe helping you is my chance to make something right before I go. Jonas clasped Dutch's shoulder. This isn't cowardice. This is bravery. And my grandfather would thank you for it. Just promise me something. Promise me you'll be careful. Garrett's got eyes everywhere, and he won't hesitate to kill you if you get too close to exposing him. I'll be careful. But I won't back down. You're Sam's grandson, all right. Dutch walked Jonas to the door. There's a back trail from here that'll take you toward the high country without going through town. I suspect that's where you're headed next. It is. Then take the trail. It'll add an hour to your ride, but it'll keep you away from Garrett's men. They've been watching the main road since you visited the ranch. Jonas shook Dutch's hand, feeling the strength still in that weathered grip. Thank you. For the journal, for the reports, and for being my grandfather's friend. Thank your grandfather for being mine, Dutch replied. Now get going. Night's coming on, and you've got a long ride ahead. Jonas rode away from Dutch Henry's shack as the last light faded from the sky. The journal and assayer's reports secure in his saddlebags alongside the documents from the cabin. He had evidence now, real, substantive evidence that could prove Garrett's fraud beyond any reasonable doubt. But he still needed the final piece. Whatever his grandfather had hidden in the high meadow, the back trail Dutch had mentioned wound through dense timber, climbing steadily into the foothills. Jonas let Charlie pick his way carefully through the darkness, trusting the horse's instincts. Above, stars emerged one by one, cold and bright against the black sky. A wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the higher elevations. Jonas's mind worked through the implications of what Dutch had told him. The pattern was clear now. Garrett had been systematically eliminating anyone who could testify against him, using Halian to make the deaths appear natural. Robert Finch, the assayer, Dutch Henry's claim theft, Sarah's husband in the mine collapse, and finally his grandfather's poisoning. How many others had there been? How many people had died to protect Garrett's stolen wealth? The anger Jonas felt was cold and focused. He'd seen enough death during the war to understand that vengeance for its own sake was hollow and destructive. But justice, that was different. Justice demanded that wrongs be righted, that the guilty face consequences, that victims be honored and remembered. His grandfather had died, believing the truth would come out eventually. Jonas intended to make sure it did. As he rode through the night, Jonas thought about Sarah Brennan, alone in her room above the general store, still gathering evidence 5 years after her husband's death. He thought about Dutch Henry, drinking away his guilt in that ramshackle cabin, carrying the weight of his silence. He thought about all the families Garrett had destroyed, all the lives he'd ruined, all in service of greed and power, and he thought about his grandfather, teaching a 12-year-old boy about honor and truth beside a mountain stream, pressing a pocket watch into his hands and telling him it represented something that lasted. The old man had been right. Truth did outlast iron. It was just that sometimes truth needed someone willing to stand for it, to fight for it, to risk everything to bring it into the light. Jonas rode on through the darkness, climbing toward the high country, carrying the evidence that would either bring Thomas Garrett down or get Jonas killed in the trying. Either way, he was committed now. There was no turning back. Behind him, unseen in the timber, 2 riders followed at a careful distance. Slade had posted watchers at every trail leading out of Red Bluff Crossing, and one of them had picked up Jonas's trail despite his precautions. The watchers didn't know where Jonas was headed, but they intended to find out and to report back to Garrett before Jonas could do whatever he was planning. The chase had begun. Jonas reached the high meadow just after dawn, his muscles aching from the long night ride. The meadow looked exactly as he remembered it, a broad expanse of grass surrounded by towering pines, with a small stream running along the eastern edge. In the center, barely visible unless you knew where to look, stood the old line shack where he and his grandfather had spent countless nights during their hunting trips. The shack was smaller than Jonas remembered, the way places from childhood always are when you return to them as an adult. But it was still sound, its log walls weathered but solid, its roof intact. Jonas dismounted and tied Charlie near the stream, where the horse could drink and graze, then approached the shack carefully, checking for signs that anyone else had been here recently. The dust on the threshold was undisturbed, and the door opened with a creak that suggested it hadn't been used in months. Inside, everything was as his grandfather had left it. A narrow cot, a small stove, shelves holding canned goods and supplies. Jonas moved to the center of the room and knelt, running his hands over the floorboards until he found the loose one, just as he remembered. He pried it up carefully, revealing the metal box beneath. The box was still there, rusted but intact. Jonas lifted it out and set it on the rough table, his heart pounding. This was it, the evidence his grandfather had died protecting. He opened the box with hands that were surprisingly steady. Inside lay a thick envelope, sealed with wax, and a smaller leather pouch. Jonas opened the envelope first and found a sheaf of papers, witness statements, each one signed and dated. He read through them slowly, his anger building with each page. The first statement was from a man named William Chase, a former employee of Garrett's, describing how he'd been ordered to alter boundary markers on the disputed claim. The second was from a woman named Martha Reynolds, who testified that Dr. Halian had asked her to purchase arsenic from a pharmacy in Silver Creek, claiming it was for rat poison, but never using it for that purpose. The third was from a banker in Denver who'd handled suspicious transactions for Garrett, moving money through multiple accounts to hide its origins. There were 5 statements in all, each one damning, each one signed by someone who'd since died under suspicious circumstances. His grandfather had been building a case methodically, gathering testimony from people willing to risk everything to see justice done. And Garrett had systematically eliminated them, one by one, until only Samuel McCord remained. The leather pouch contained something even more valuable, a letter written by Robert Finch, the original assayer, dated just before his death. In it, Finch described being approached by Garrett and offered money to alter his reports. When Finch refused, Garrett had threatened him. Finch had written the letter as insurance, intending to keep it hidden until he could deliver it safely to authorities. "If you're reading this," the letter concluded, "then I'm likely dead, and Garrett has made good on his threats. But the truth remains. The North Valley claim contains deposits worth at least $500,000 in gold, and Thomas Garrett has stolen it through fraud, forgery, and murder. I pray this letter reaches someone brave enough to stand against him." Jonas sat back, feeling the weight of these testimonies. Combined with Dutch Henry's journal and the assayer's reports, he now had everything he needed to prove Garrett's crimes beyond any doubt. The question was how to get this evidence to someone who could act on it, someone beyond Garrett's reach and influence. He was considering his options when Charlie whinnied nervously outside. Jonas moved to the window and spotted 2 riders emerging from the tree line on the far side of the meadow. Even at this distance he recognized them, Slade and one of the Denton brothers. They'd followed him. Jonas cursed himself for not being more careful. He'd been so focused on reaching the meadow and finding the evidence that he'd failed to check his back trail. Now Garrett's men knew where he was, and they'd seen him entering the line shack. They'd know he'd found something. He watched as the 2 men split up, one circling around to cover the back of the shack while the other approached from the front. They were taking their time, confident that Jonas was trapped. And they were right. The shack had only 2 ways out, and both were now covered. Jonas quickly gathered the evidence and stuffed it back into the metal box. He couldn't let Garrett's men take it, couldn't let his grandfather's work be destroyed. But he also couldn't fight his way out of this situation. 2 armed men, trained and ruthless, against 1 man in a building with no real defenses. The mathematics of survival didn't favor him. Then he remembered something his grandfather had shown him years ago, a third way out that wasn't obvious unless you knew to look for it. The floor of the shack was raised about 2 feet off the ground to keep it dry during spring runoff. Underneath, there was a crawl space that led to an opening on the south side, hidden by brush. His grandfather had used it once to escape a bear that had tried to trap them inside. Jonas had been 14 at the time, small enough to fit through easily. Now as a full-grown man it would be tight, but it might work. He moved quickly, pulling up more floorboards to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. He lowered the metal box down first, then followed it into the cramped darkness beneath the shack. The space smelled of earth and old timber, and Jonas had to crawl on his belly, dragging the box behind him. Outside, he heard Slade's voice calling, "McCord! We know you're in there. Come out and this can go easy. We just want to talk." Jonas kept crawling, ignoring the voice, focusing on reaching the hidden opening. He could hear footsteps on the shack's porch now, the creak of the door opening. They'd be inside in moments, and they'd see the disturbed floorboards. "He's not here," the Denton brother called. "But the floor's torn up. He must have found something." "Check under the shack," Slade ordered. "He can't have gone far." Jonas reached the opening just as he heard someone drop to the ground behind him. He pushed the metal box through first, then squeezed his shoulders through the narrow gap. For a terrible moment, he thought he wouldn't fit. His chest caught on the frame and he was stuck, unable to move forward or back. Behind him, he heard someone crawling into the space, cursing as they came. With a desperate surge of effort, Jonas pulled himself through, feeling splinters tear his shirt and skin. He grabbed the metal box and ran for the tree line, keeping low, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. Behind him, shouts erupted as Garrett's men realized he'd escaped. A gunshot cracked across the meadow, and Jonas heard the bullet whine past his head. He dove behind a fallen log and came up running, zigzagging through the timber. Another shot, and bark exploded from a tree beside him. But he was in the forest now, and Jonas knew these woods better than any man alive. He'd spent 10 years in terrain like this, learning every trick of movement and concealment. He ran deeper into the timber, carrying the metal box clutched to his chest like a child. Behind him, he could hear Slade and the Denton brother crashing through the underbrush, calling to each other as they tried to track him. But Jonas was already thinking 3 moves ahead, using game trails and creek beds to mask his passage, doubling back and circling around in patterns that would confuse anyone trying to follow. After an hour of hard movement, Jonas paused in a dense thicket to catch his breath and assess his situation. He'd lost his horse. Charlie was still tied at the meadow, and there was no way to retrieve him without being caught. His supplies were in his saddlebags, which meant he was now on foot in the high country with nothing but the clothes on his back, his weapons and the metal box of evidence. But he was alive, and he still had what he'd come for. That was what mattered. Jonas took a moment to check the pocket watch. It read just past 9 in the morning. He'd need to move carefully now, staying off the main trails, working his way back toward Red Bluff Crossing through terrain where horses couldn't easily follow. It would take him 2 days on foot, maybe 3, but he'd make it. He had to, because now Garrett knew that Jonas had found his grandfather's evidence. The careful game of investigation and legal maneuvering was over. Garrett would come at him directly now, with all the force and violence he could muster. The only question was whether Jonas could get the evidence to safety before that happened. He took one last look at the high meadow in the distance, remembering all the peaceful days he'd spent there with his grandfather. Those days were gone now, burned away by betrayal and murder, but their memory would sustain him through what came next. Jonas McCord turned and headed down the mountain, moving like a ghost through the timber, carrying the truth that would either save him or kill him. 2 days later, exhausted and hungry but still moving, Jonas reached the outskirts of Red Bluff Crossing just after dark. He'd traveled the back ways, avoiding roads and settlements, living on stream water and the few edible plants he could forage in the late autumn woods. The metal box remained secure, strapped to his back with strips torn from his shirt. He'd protected it even when it meant sleeping cold or going without food. But now, as he surveyed the town from the shelter of the tree line, Jonas knew something was wrong. There were too many men moving through the streets for this time of night, too many horses tied at the rails. And there, outside Sarah's building above the general store, stood 2 of Garrett's men, clearly standing watch. Jonas's stomach clenched with dread. If they were watching Sarah's place, that meant Garrett had made a move against her. The question was why, and how much danger she was in. He circled around, approaching from the back of the buildings, moving through the shadows with the stealth his mountain years had taught him. The alley behind the general store was empty, and Jonas climbed the outside stairs to Sarah's room as quietly as he could. The blue door was slightly ajar, and no light showed from within. Jonas drew his revolver and pushed the door open slowly. The room beyond was dark and still. He stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness, and his boot struck something soft. Looking down, he saw papers scattered across the floor. Sarah's unofficial records, torn from her notebook and strewn about as if someone had searched through them in anger. "Sarah?" he called softly. No answer. He found a lamp and lit it with shaking hands. The room had been thoroughly ransacked. Sarah's desk was overturned, her files emptied, her few personal possessions smashed or scattered. And on the desk, held down by a knife driven through the wood, was a note in bold, angry handwriting. McCord. "If you want her alive, bring the evidence to the mine. Come alone. Come before dawn or she dies. T.G." Jonas stood there, the note in his hand, feeling ice spread through his veins. Garrett had Sarah, had taken her because Jonas had proven too difficult to kill directly, because he needed leverage. And now Jonas faced an impossible choice. Give up the evidence that could bring Garrett down, or let an innocent woman die. He sank into the one remaining chair, his mind racing. Every instinct told him this was a trap. Even if he brought the evidence, Garrett would kill them both. The man couldn't afford to let either of them live, not now that he knew how much proof existed of his crimes. But if Jonas didn't go, Sarah would die for certain, and her blood would be on his hands. There had to be another way. There had to be something he wasn't seeing, some angle he could use. Jonas forced himself to think past the fear and exhaustion, to approach this as a problem with a solution. Then he remembered something, a comment Sarah had made about sending a telegram to the territorial marshal. Jonas had dismissed it at the time, assuming the marshal was compromised. But what if he sent multiple telegrams? What if he contacted not just the marshal, but the territorial governor, the federal land office, the Denver newspapers? What if he made enough noise that Garrett couldn't silence it all? Jonas left Sarah's room and headed for the telegraph office, moving through the back alleys. The office was closed at this hour, but Jonas knew the operator, a man named Wilson, who lived above the office. He threw pebbles at the upstairs window until Wilson appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mr. McCord." "What in the blazes? I need to send telegrams. Multiple telegrams. Right now. It's past midnight. Can't it wait until morning?" "No, it can't." Jonas climbed up to Wilson's window. "And I need you to send them exactly as I write them, and to tell no one, especially not anyone who works for Thomas Garrett." Something in Jonas's expression must have convinced Wilson of the urgency. He nodded and let Jonas inside, leading him down to the telegraph office. Jonas wrote out 5 messages, his hand cramping from the effort of keeping the words clear and precise. The first telegram went to the territorial marshal in Silver Creek, detailing Garrett's crimes and stating that complete evidence would be delivered within 24 hours. The second went to the territorial governor in Denver, making formal accusations of murder, fraud, and corruption. The third went to the federal land office, reporting fraudulent claim transfers. The fourth went to the Denver Post, offering an exclusive story about a major gold fraud. And the fifth went to the sheriff in Silver Creek, requesting immediate assistance with a kidnapping. "Send them all," Jonas told Wilson. "And if anything happens to me, send them again tomorrow. Keep sending them until someone responds." Wilson read through the telegrams, his eyes widening. "Mr. McCord, do you know what you're doing? Thomas Garrett is going to... I know exactly what he's going to do. That's why I need these sent now, before he can stop them." Wilson nodded and began tapping out the messages on his telegraph key. Jonas waited, listening to the clicking rhythm, knowing that with each telegram sent, he was making it harder for Garrett to simply kill everyone and hide the evidence. The more official eyes that turned toward Red Bluff Crossing, the less room Garrett would have to maneuver. When the last telegram was sent, Jonas thanked Wilson and slipped back out into the night. He had perhaps 4 hours until dawn, 4 hours to plan and prepare for what came next. He couldn't go to the mine alone and unarmed, as Garrett demanded. That would be suicide. But he also couldn't leave Sarah in Garrett's hands while he waited for help that might not arrive in time. Jonas made his way back to his grandfather's cabin, moving through the darkness like a shadow. Inside, he quickly gathered what he needed: extra ammunition, a rope, a knife, and most importantly, the duplicate set of documents he'd made before leaving for the high meadow. He'd learned in the war to never put all your resources in one place, and that lesson served him now. He placed the duplicate documents in a leather satchel, along with Dutch Henry's journal and all the evidence he'd gathered. Then he took the original documents from the metal box and hid them in a waterproof pouch, which he buried beneath the floorboards where the crates had been. If he didn't survive the night, at least the evidence would still exist, would still be findable by anyone who came looking. With that done, Jonas sat down at his grandfather's workbench and wrote a letter of his own. It was addressed to Sarah Brennan, but it was really for anyone who might read it after he was gone. To whoever finds this, my name is Jonas McCord. My grandfather, Samuel McCord, was murdered by Thomas Garrett through slow poisoning. Garrett has committed fraud, theft, and multiple murders over a period of 20 years. Complete evidence of these crimes is hidden beneath the floorboards in this cabin. I have gone to rescue Sarah Brennan, who Garrett has kidnapped. If I don't return, please ensure this evidence reaches the proper authorities. The truth matters more than anyone's life. J. McCord, October 14th, 1876. He left the letter on the workbench where it would be easily found, weighted down with his grandfather's pocket watch. The watch ticked steadily, marking the passage of time toward dawn. Jonas picked it up one last time, reading the inscription, "Truth outlasts iron." "I hope you were right," he said quietly to the memory of his grandfather. "I hope the truth is worth what it's going to cost." Then Jonas McCord checked his weapons, shouldered the satchel with the duplicate evidence, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness toward Garrett's mine. He didn't expect to survive what came next, but he'd make sure that even in death, he'd struck a blow that Garrett couldn't recover from. The telegrams were sent, the evidence was secured, and now Jonas would do what he could to save Sarah and make Garrett pay for every life he'd taken. The mine sat in a hollow between two ridges, about an hour's hard climb from the main road. Jonas approached from above, using the route Sarah had described, moving from cover to cover as the sky began to lighten in the east. He could see the mine entrance below, a dark opening framed with timber, with several buildings scattered nearby. Lamplight showed in one of the buildings, and Jonas could see men moving about. He counted at least 6 of them, all armed. Garrett was taking no chances. Jonas circled the perimeter, looking for weaknesses, for any advantage he could exploit. The mine itself offered possibilities, multiple tunnels, narrow passages where numbers wouldn't help, places where a man who knew what he was doing could turn the terrain against his enemies. But first, he needed to know where they were holding Sarah. Jonas worked his way closer, using the pre-dawn shadows until he could peer through a window of the building that showed light. Inside, he saw Garrett sitting at a rough table, Dr. Halian beside him. And there, tied to a chair in the corner, was Sarah. She looked frightened but unharmed, her jaw set with the same determination Jonas had seen in her office. Garrett was speaking, though Jonas couldn't hear the words through the thick walls. But he could read the body language. Garrett was confident, relaxed, a man who believed he'd already won. Halian looked nervous, fidgeting with something in his medical bag. The other men, Slade and the Dentons plus 3 others Jonas didn't recognize, stood guard both inside and outside the building. As Jonas watched, trying to formulate a plan, Sarah's eyes suddenly lifted and met his through the window. For a long moment they stared at each other. Then Sarah gave the tiniest shake of her head, a clear warning. "Don't come in. It's a trap." But Jonas had known it was a trap from the beginning. The question was whether he was smart enough to turn it against Garrett. He checked his pocket watch. 15 minutes until dawn, until Garrett's deadline. 15 minutes to find a way to save Sarah, expose Garrett's crimes, and survive long enough to see justice done. Jonas smiled grimly. He'd faced worse odds in the war. At least this time, he was fighting for something that mattered. He slipped back into the darkness to make his final preparations, leaving Sarah to watch the window and hope that Samuel McCord's grandson was half as resourceful as the old man had been. Because if he wasn't, they'd both be dead before the sun cleared the eastern peaks. Jonas moved quickly through the pre-dawn darkness, circling the mine complex with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent years moving unseen through hostile territory. He'd learned patience in the war, learned that rushed actions got men killed. Now he took his time, studying the layout, noting where Garrett's men were posted, looking for the weaknesses in their defense. The mine entrance itself was the obvious approach, wide, well lit by torches and heavily guarded. Slade stood there with 2 men, watching the trail that led up from Red Bluff Crossing. They expected Jonas to come that way, walking into their trap with his hands up and the evidence in a bag. That was what Garrett wanted, and Garrett was accustomed to getting what he wanted, but Jonas had no intention of giving it to him. Instead, Jonas worked his way around to the back of the complex, where the mine's ventilation shaft emerged from the hillside. His grandfather had told him about these shafts years ago. Every deep mine needed them to provide fresh air to the workers below. They were usually narrow, vertical holes reinforced with timber and covered with grating to keep animals and debris out. Jonas found the shaft exactly where he expected it, hidden in a cluster of rocks and brush about 50 yards from the main entrance. The grating was secured with a simple padlock, rusted but still functional. Jonas used his knife to work at the screws, holding the lock's mounting plate, a technique he'd learned from a safecracker during the war. After several minutes of careful work, the screws came free and he lifted the grating away. The shaft dropped straight down into darkness, and Jonas couldn't tell how deep it went. He lowered a stone on a string and counted, 30 feet, maybe a bit more. Climbing down would be treacherous, especially in the dark, but it would put him inside the mine complex, where Garrett's men wouldn't be expecting him. Jonas tied his rope to a sturdy pine and tested the knot. Then he secured the satchel with the evidence across his back, checked his revolver one more time, and lowered himself into the shaft. The walls were rough-hewn rock, damp with condensation, and barely wide enough for his shoulders. He descended slowly, bracing his feet against opposite walls, feeling his way down in the blackness. After what seemed like an eternity, his boots touched solid ground. Jonas found himself in a narrow tunnel, barely tall enough to stand upright. The air smelled of earth and rock dust, and the faint metallic tang of gold ore. Somewhere ahead, he could see the dim glow of lamplight and hear voices echoing through the passages. He moved forward carefully, one hand trailing along the wall, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The tunnel branched several times, but Jonas followed the light and the voices, working his way toward the main chamber. As he got closer, he could make out individual words drifting back through the stone passages. "Should be here by now," someone was saying. "Slade," Jonas thought. "He'll come." That was Garrett's voice, confident and cold. "He won't let the woman die. Men like him, men with honor, they're predictable, easy to manipulate. And if he doesn't bring the evidence, then Halian administers the woman's medicine. We dispose of both bodies in the deep shaft, and we disappear the evidence ourselves. Either way, this ends today." Jonas felt his jaw tighten. So that was the plan. Kill them both, regardless of whether he cooperated, then make their bodies vanish in the abandoned sections of the mine where they'd never be found. It was exactly what he'd expected, which was why he'd made sure to leave that letter at the cabin and send those telegrams. Even if Garrett killed him, the evidence would survive. But Jonas had no intention of dying today if he could help it. He continued forward until he reached a point where the tunnel opened into a larger space. Peering around the corner, he saw the main chamber of the mine, a cavern perhaps 40 feet across, lit by lanterns hanging from timber supports. The walls still showed veins of gold-bearing quartz, glinting in the lamplight. This was the heart of what Garrett had stolen, the source of his wealth and power. In the center of the chamber stood Sarah, still tied to her chair. Garrett sat nearby on a crate, checking his pocket watch with evident impatience. Halian paced nervously, his medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. 3 of Garrett's men stood guard, Slade near the main entrance, and the 2 Denton brothers positioned at other tunnel mouths. Jonas counted heads and calculated odds. 6 men total if he included the 2 guards outside, versus himself alone. But he had surprise, he had knowledge of the terrain, and he had something Garrett didn't, nothing left to lose. A man with nothing to lose could take risks that others wouldn't dare. He also had one more advantage: dynamite. Jonas had spotted a box of it near the mine entrance during his reconnaissance, standard equipment for mine operations. If he could reach it without being seen, he could use it to collapse strategic sections of the mine, trap Garrett's men, create chaos that would give him a chance to reach Sarah. Jonas backtracked through the tunnel until he found a side passage that seemed to lead toward the entrance. He moved through it quickly but quietly, aware that time was running short. The sky outside would be lightening now, approaching Garrett's deadline. If Jonas didn't act soon, Halian would dose Sarah with whatever poison he had prepared, and the chance to save her would be lost. The side passage emerged near the entrance, in a section where mining equipment was stored. Jonas could see the main entrance about 20 feet away, could see the 2 guards standing there, looking out toward the trail. Between him and them lay shadow and rock, and 30 feet of open ground he'd have to cross to reach the dynamite. He waited, watching the guards' patterns, learning their rhythms. They were bored, inattentive, expecting Jonas to announce himself from the front like a fool. After a few minutes, both men turned to look down the trail at the same moment. Drawn by some sound or movement in the forest below, Jonas moved fast, covering the distance in a low run, snatching 3 sticks of dynamite from the box and retreating back into the shadows before the guards turned around. His heart hammered in his chest, but he'd made it without being seen. Now came the difficult part. Jonas worked his way back through the tunnels toward the main chamber, looking for strategic positions where he could place charges. His plan was simple but risky. Use the dynamite to collapse sections of tunnel, separating Garrett's men from each other and from their escape routes. Then in the confusion, get to Sarah and fight his way out with her. It wasn't a good plan. There were too many things that could go wrong, too many variables he couldn't control. But it was the only plan he had, and dawn was breaking. He could see faint light beginning to filter into the mine from the entrance. Jonas placed the first stick of dynamite in a narrow section of tunnel between the main chamber and the entrance, where a collapse would trap Garrett inside, but leave the ventilation shaft as a potential escape route for Jonas and Sarah. He set a long fuse, giving himself time to position the other charges. The second stick went in a support timber near where Slade stood guard, positioned so that when it blew, it would bring down rock and debris that would block that section of the chamber. The third stick he kept in his hand, ready to use as needed. Everything was in position. Jonas took a moment to steady himself, checking the pocket watch one last time. It read 5:47. The sun would be up in minutes, and Garrett's patience would be exhausted. Time to move. Jonas lit the first fuse and retreated into the shadows, watching as it sparked and hissed its way toward the dynamite. Then he moved to the second position and lit that fuse as well. 30 seconds, maybe 40, before the first charge blew. He had to be in position to reach Sarah when the chaos started. He worked his way around to a position near where Sarah sat, still concealed in the tunnel mouth, his revolver drawn and ready. From here, he could see her face in the lamplight, see the fear she was trying to hide behind a mask of defiance. He could also see Garrett checking his watch again, then nodding to Halian. "It's past dawn," Garrett said. "He's not coming." "Give her the first dose." Halian moved toward Sarah with a vial in his hand, and Jonas knew he was out of time. He stepped out of the shadows, his revolver aimed at Garrett's chest. "I'm here," Jonas said calmly. "Let her go." Every head in the chamber turned toward him. Slade's hand dropped toward his gun, but Jonas swung his aim to cover him. "I wouldn't," Jonas said. "Not unless you want to die in the next 3 seconds." Garrett recovered first, his face splitting into a cold smile. "Mr. McCord, how resourceful of you to find another entrance. But as you can see, you're outnumbered and surrounded. Put down your weapon." "I don't think so. I came to make a trade, the evidence for the woman. We both know that trade would be meaningless." "You'd never leave this mine alive." "Probably not," Jonas agreed. "But neither would you." That's when the first charge blew. The explosion was enormous in the confined space, a rolling boom that shook the walls and sent rock dust billowing through the chamber. Men shouted and dove for cover. Lanterns swung wildly on their hooks, casting crazy shadows. And in that moment of chaos, Jonas moved. He sprinted toward Sarah, firing twice at the nearest guard as he ran. Both shots hit home and the man went down. Jonas reached Sarah's chair and cut her bonds with his knife in one smooth motion. "Can you run?" he asked. "Yes," she gasped. The second charge blew, bringing down a section of timber near where Slade had been standing. More dust, more confusion, more noise. Jonas grabbed Sarah's hand and ran for the ventilation shaft tunnel, the one escape route he'd left open. Behind them, Garrett was shouting orders, trying to restore control. Gunshots echoed through the chamber as his men fired blindly into the dust and darkness. Jonas and Sarah plunged into the tunnel, running hard, and Jonas lit the third stick of dynamite as they passed, tossing it behind them to collapse the tunnel entrance, and by precious seconds, they reached the ventilation shaft just as the third explosion thundered through the mine. The rope was still there, hanging from above. Jonas boosted Sarah up first, watching as she climbed with desperate speed toward the circle of daylight above. Then he followed, his muscles screaming with effort, expecting at any moment to feel a bullet slam into his back. But the bullet didn't come. They reached the surface, and Jonas pulled up the rope behind them, collapsing the shaft entrance with rocks and brush to make it harder to follow. Then they ran, crashing through the timber as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, running toward Red Bluff Crossing and whatever safety they might find there. Behind them, muffled by tons of rock, they could hear men shouting and digging, trying to clear the collapsed tunnels. They'd get out eventually, Jonas knew. But by then, he and Sarah would be gone, and the evidence would be in hands that Garrett couldn't reach. At least that was the plan. Whether it would work remained to be seen. They made it perhaps a mile before Jonas heard the sounds of pursuit behind them. Horses moving fast, crashing through the underbrush with the confidence of men who knew these trails. Garrett's men had gotten out faster than Jonas had hoped, and now they were coming hard. "We need to find defensible ground," Jonas said, his breath coming hard from the run. Sarah was holding up well, but he could see she was tiring. "Somewhere we can make a stand. There's an old homestead about half a mile ahead," Sarah gasped. "Stone foundation, still solid. Henry and I used to picnic there." They pushed on, Jonas checking behind them frequently. He could see riders now through the trees, at least 3 of them, maybe more. They'd be in rifle range within minutes. The homestead appeared ahead, a collapsed cabin with stone walls still standing 3 feet high, surrounded by what had once been a cleared field. It offered visibility in all directions and decent cover from the stone. Jonas and Sarah scrambled over the wall and took positions on opposite sides. Jonas with his revolver and rifle, Sarah with the extra pistol he'd given her. "You know how to use that?" he asked. "Henry taught me. I'm not fast, but I can hit what I aim at." The riders came into view at the edge of the clearing, Slade in the lead, followed by both Denton brothers and 2 others Jonas didn't recognize. 5 men, all armed, all experienced fighters. Behind them, Jonas could see more riders coming, and he knew one of them would be Garrett himself. The man wouldn't leave this finish to others. Slade reined in about 100 yards out, just beyond accurate pistol range. He studied the homestead, clearly weighing his options. He had the numbers, but Jonas had cover and position. A frontal assault would be costly. "McCord!" Slade called. "There's no way out of this. Give up now, and we'll make it quick." "Come and take us," Jonas called back. Slade turned and conferred with the Denton brothers. Jonas used the time to check his ammunition. 12 rounds in his revolver, 8 in the rifle. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough to make them pay dearly for every yard they advanced. The riders split up, circling the homestead, trying to find angles that would let them fire without exposing themselves. Jonas tracked them with his rifle, waiting for someone to make a mistake. When one of the unknown riders moved too far into the open, Jonas fired. The shot caught the man in the shoulder, and he fell from his horse with a cry of pain. 4 left, and now they knew Jonas could shoot. They tried a different approach, 2 riders creating a distraction on one side while the others attempted to close from another angle. But Jonas had fought this kind of fight before, had learned in the war how to defend a position against superior numbers. He and Sarah worked together, calling out positions, covering each other's blind spots, making every shot count. Another of Garrett's men went down, this one to Sarah's pistol at closer range. The man had tried to rush their position during a reload, and Sarah had calmly aimed and fired, her bullet catching him center mass. The man's horse bolted, and his body lay still in the tall grass. 3 now. But Jonas's ammunition was running low, and he knew more men would be coming. This wasn't a fight he could win, not in the long term. The best he could hope for was to hold out long enough for help to arrive, if help was coming at all. Then he heard it, a sound that made his heart leap with hope. A steam whistle, distant but clear, coming from the direction of Red Bluff Crossing. The morning train, arriving on schedule. And if Jonas's telegrams had reached the right people, that train might be carrying more than just passengers and freight. Slade heard it too, and Jonas saw uncertainty cross the man's scarred face. Whatever Slade had been planning, the arrival of the train complicated things. If federal marshals or territorial authorities were on board, Garrett's window for silencing Jonas and Sarah was closing fast. "Pull back," Slade called to his remaining men. "Regroup at the tree line." They withdrew, but Jonas knew this wasn't over. They were waiting for Garrett to arrive, waiting for orders. And when those orders came, Jonas suspected they'd involve overwhelming force, witnesses or no witnesses. Garrett had too much at stake now to worry about subtlety. Jonas reloaded his weapons with his remaining ammunition and looked at Sarah. She was pale but composed, holding the pistol with steady hands. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming for me, for not trading the evidence for my life." "We're not out of this yet," Jonas replied. But he reached across and squeezed her hand briefly. "But we will be. I promise you that." The steam whistle sounded again, closer now. And in the distance, Jonas could hear more horses coming, a lot of them moving fast. The final confrontation was at hand, and everything he and his grandfather had fought for would be decided in the next few minutes. Jonas checked his grandfather's pocket watch one more time. It read 6:23. The truth had outlasted iron for this long. Now it just needed to last a little longer. Thomas Garrett arrived at the head of a column of riders, Dr. Halian beside him, looking pale and nervous in the morning light. Garrett sat his horse with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, and Jonas could see the calculation in his eyes as he surveyed the situation. 2 of his men down, Slade and the others pinned at the tree line, and Jonas and Sarah alive and armed behind stone walls. "This has gone on long enough," Garrett called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Jonas McCord, you've caused me considerable trouble, but I'm prepared to be reasonable. Right away now, leave the evidence and I'll let you both live." "You have my word." "Your word means nothing," Jonas replied. "You've already shown what it's worth." Garrett's expression hardened. "Then you'll die here. Both of you. And no one will ever know what happened. You'll simply disappear, like so many others who've crossed me over the years." "That's where you're wrong," Jonas said. "Because I sent telegrams last night. To the territorial marshal, the governor, the federal land office, and the newspapers. By now, dozens of people know about your crimes. Kill us if you want, but the truth is already out there. You can't silence it anymore." For the first time, Jonas saw real fear flash across Garrett's face. The man had built his empire on secrecy and the careful elimination of witnesses. But Jonas had changed the equation. Even if Garrett killed them both right now, the investigation would continue. The evidence would be found. The truth would come out. "You're bluffing," Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Then why do I hear a train whistle? Why is there a locomotive sitting in Red Bluff Crossing right now, probably carrying federal marshals, responding to those telegrams?" Garrett turned to look toward town, and Jonas saw him weigh his options. He could still kill Jonas and Sarah, but it would no longer serve his purpose. With federal authorities arriving, with investigations beginning, murder would only add to the charges against him. His best play now was to retreat, to use his lawyers and his money to fight the accusations, to try to outlast the scandal. But Jonas could see that Garrett knew he'd lost. Everything the man had built over 20 years was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "If you think federal marshals will believe your story over mine," Garrett began. But Jonas cut him off. "It's not just my story anymore. It's Dutch Henry's journal, documenting every theft and fraud. It's the original assayer's reports, showing the real value of the claim. It's witness statements from 5 people you had killed. It's your forged documents, compared to my grandfather's real signature. It's a letter from Robert Finch, written before you murdered him. It's everything, Garrett. Every crime, every death, every lie. All documented, all preserved, all on its way to people who have the power to act on it." Jonas saw Halian turn his horse as if to run, but Slade moved to block him. Whatever happened next, Garrett's men weren't going to let the doctor escape to save himself. That's when Jonas heard the sound that changed everything. Hoofbeats, a lot of them, coming fast from the direction of town. A moment later, riders appeared at the far end of the clearing, at least a dozen of them. The lead rider wore a federal marshal's badge that caught the morning sun, and the men with him were armed and organized. The marshal raised his hand, and his men spread out in a practiced formation surrounding Garrett's group. The numerical advantage had shifted in an instant, and everyone knew it. "Thomas Garrett," the marshal called out, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "I'm Marshal William Tate, acting on telegraphic authority from the territorial governor. You and your men are under arrest for fraud, murder, and attempted kidnapping. Order your men to put down their weapons." For a long moment, Garrett sat frozen on his horse. Jonas could see him calculating one last time, weighing the odds of fighting his way out against the certainty of capture. Then slowly the fight went out of him. His shoulders sagged, and he seemed to age 10 years in an instant. "Do as he says," Garrett told his men. "Put down your weapons." Slade looked like he wanted to argue, but even he could see there was no winning this fight. The men dismounted and laid down their guns, and the federal marshals moved in to secure them. Marshal Tate rode over to the homestead where Jonas and Sarah stood. He was a solid-looking man in his 50s, with grey in his beard and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years enforcing the law in hard country. "Jonas McCord?" he asked. "That's right. Your telegrams caused quite a stir in Silver Creek. The governor himself ordered me to take the morning train down here." Tate looked at the scene before him. The wounded men, the guns, the standoff that had just ended. "Looks like we got here just in time." "Just in time," Jonas agreed, feeling the tension drain from his body for the first time in days. He looked at Sarah, saw tears of relief streaming down her face, and felt his own eyes sting with emotion he'd been holding back too long. Marshal Tate dismounted and approached the stone wall. "I'm going to need statements from both of you, and I understand you have evidence of multiple crimes." Jonas unbuckled the satchel from his back and handed it over. "Everything you need is in there. Documents, witness statements, journals, proof of fraud, forgery, and murder going back 20 years. There's more evidence hidden at my grandfather's cabin. I can show you where." Tate opened the satchel and leafed through the contents, his expression growing more serious with each document he examined. "This is extensive, very thorough. My grandfather spent years gathering it. He died for it. I just finished what he started. Then he'd be proud of you." Tate closed the satchel and signaled to his deputies. "Take Garrett and the others into custody. Get the wounded men medical attention, real medical attention. Not from Dr. Halian. He's under arrest too. Jonas watched as Garrett was led away in chains. The man who'd seemed so powerful just days ago, now reduced to a prisoner facing justice. As Garrett passed the homestead, he looked up and met Jonas's eyes. "You've won nothing," Garrett said quietly. "I have lawyers. I have money. I have friends in high places. This isn't over." "Yes," Jonas said. "It is." And watching Garrett being led away toward the train that would carry him to prison, Jonas believed it. The fight might not be completely finished. There would be trials, testimony, legal battles. But the crucial battle, the one his grandfather had died fighting, was won. The truth was out, protected now by federal authority, beyond Garrett's power to suppress. Jonas put his arm around Sarah's shoulders as she leaned against him, exhausted but alive. Together, they watched the sun climb higher over the mountains, illuminating a valley that was finally free of Thomas Garrett's shadow. 3 months later, Jonas stood at his grandfather's grave as the first snow of winter began to fall. The wooden marker had been replaced with a proper stone, carved with Samuel McCord's name, dates, and a simple inscription Jonas had chosen. Truth outlasts iron. The trial was over. Garrett had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted kidnapping. Dr. Halian had turned state's evidence in exchange for a lighter sentence, providing detailed testimony about the poisonings he'd carried out on Garrett's orders. Slade and the Dentons were serving time for attempted murder and kidnapping. The full extent of Garrett's criminal empire had been exposed, and property stolen from dozens of families over the years was being returned to its rightful owners. The North Valley gold claim now belonged to Jonas, its ownership legally restored by the territorial court. The mine was producing again, this time operated fairly and honestly, providing work for men who'd lost their jobs when Garrett's empire collapsed. Jonas had hired Dutch Henry as foreman, and the old prospector had risen to the challenge, bringing both his knowledge and his sobriety to the task. But Jonas wasn't thinking about gold or justice or legal victories as he stood in the falling snow. He was thinking about the man buried beneath this stone, about all the years they'd spent together and all the years they'd spent apart, about lessons learned and wisdom passed down, about the price of standing for what was right. "I did it," Jonas said quietly to the grave. "Just like you asked, just like you knew I would." The truth came out, and it made a difference. The wind moved through the pines, sounding almost like an answer, almost like approval. Jonas stood there a while longer, watching the snow accumulate on the stone, remembering. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Sarah climbing the hill, wrapped in a thick coat against the cold. She'd been at the land office, finishing up the last of the paperwork related to the property restorations. In the months since the trial, they'd worked closely together, and what had begun as a shared mission for justice had grown into something deeper. "I thought I'd find you here," Sarah said, coming to stand beside him. She took his hand, and they stood together looking at the grave. "I keep wondering if he knew," Jonas said. "If he knew when he wrote that letter that I'd come, that I'd see it through." "He knew," Sarah said with certainty. "He talked about you in the months before he died. He said his grandson was the finest man he'd ever known, and that when the time came, you'd do what needed to be done." Jonas felt his throat tighten. "I stayed away too long. I should have come back sooner. Maybe, but you came back when it mattered, and you finished what he started." Sarah squeezed his hand. "He'd be proud, Jonas, not just of what you did, but of who you are." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the snow fall. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice tentative. "Have you thought any more about what you're going to do? Now that everything's settled?" Jonas had been thinking about little else. The high country still called to him, those quiet places where a man could be alone with the wind and the sky. But the solitude that had once felt like peace now felt more like loneliness. He'd spent 10 years running from memories of the war, hiding from the world and from himself. But in coming down to fight for his grandfather's legacy, he'd rediscovered something he'd lost, a sense of purpose, of connection, of being part of something larger than his own pain. "I thought I'd stay," Jonas said, the words feeling right as he spoke them. The mine needs running, and there's work to be done rebuilding what Garrett destroyed. And there's someone here I'd like to get to know better if she's willing. Sarah's face lit up with a smile that warmed him more than any fire. I'd like that very much. They walked down the hill together as the snow fell more heavily, leaving clean white tracks behind them. At the edge of the cemetery, Jonas paused and looked back one more time at his grandfather's grave. Already disappearing beneath the gathering snow, he thought about the pocket watch in his vest, still ticking steadily, still marking time as it had through 3 generations. He thought about the words engraved on its back, about truth and iron and the things that lasted. His grandfather had given him more than a mine or a claim or even justice for his death. He'd given Jonas a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, worth standing for, even when the cost was high, and he'd given Jonas a way back to the world, a path from isolation to connection, from hiding to living fully again. Jonas turned and walked with Sarah toward town, toward the cabin he was rebuilding on the site of his grandfather's old place, toward the life he was beginning to construct from the pieces of his past and the possibilities of his future. The snow fell softly around them, covering the old wounds, making everything clean and new. Above them the mountains stood eternal and patient, holding their secrets and their beauty. Jonas knew he'd go back to the high country sometimes. It was part of him, and always would be. But he also knew now that a man couldn't live his whole life above the tree line, separate from his fellow humans, untouched by their struggles and their joys. His grandfather had understood that, had lived it, had built a life that mattered not because it was easy or safe, but because it stood for something true. Jonas McCord intended to do the same. The gold claim would provide material wealth, but what his grandfather had really left him was more valuable than any vein of ore, a legacy of honor, a commitment to truth, and the courage to face whatever came with integrity intact. As he and Sarah walked through the falling snow toward Red Bluff Crossing, Jonas felt his grandfather's presence like a blessing, like approval, like the passing of a torch from one generation to the next. The old man was gone, but what he'd stood for remained. Carried forward now by his grandson, protected and honored and lived, truth really did outlast iron, and in the end, that truth had set them all free. The snow continued to fall, gentle and constant, covering the valley in white. And in the pines above the cemetery, the wind sang a song that sounded like peace, like justice, like the quiet satisfaction of a good fight well fought and a good man well remembered. Jonas and Sarah disappeared into the falling snow, walking toward their future together, carrying the past with them but no longer bound by it. Behind them the mountains watched and approved, as they always had and always would, keeping their own counsel, marking the passage of seasons and lives with patient indifference. But among the stones in the cemetery on the hill, one grave stood testament to a simple truth, that one good man, standing firm against corruption and greed, could make a difference that lasted far beyond his own life. That legacy lived on in his grandson now, and would live on in all who heard the story and chose to stand for what was right. No matter the cost, the end came gently, as all good endings should, with snow falling and justice done, and 2 people walking together into whatever tomorrow might bring. And somewhere in the high country, in those places where Jonas had spent a decade learning to be at peace, the mountains kept their vigil, holding space for both solitude and connection. For both endings and beginnings, the story was finished, but the life it had shaped was just beginning.